So welcome back at AskProf2 for this operations module. Hopefully you really enjoyed, but I'm a little disappointed that I don't get questions from you from earlier in the few weeks before. But now I'm really compensated by you because I have a lot of questions and I like to go through together with you. So question number one I like to discuss with you is one of the students asked me, how do you ensure that the theory is as close at the practice as possible? Yeah, that's always a really nice question because that's really the essence of operations. You like to have the theoretical design as close as possible to the practical side. Mostly, daily I would say it is, but when there are disruptions, then you go on and then you're off track, and then what? And that's what you have to find out. How can I connect as soon as possible and how to close connection to the theory as possible? And that's the question you have to solve. It's not easy, and the more complex and constraints you have and the more rolling stock owners you have or stakeholders, the more difficult it is to solve all these issues, especially when you have disruptions. But I think that's the essence of operations. Another question is about capacity model. When I read the question of one of the students says, hello there, in the previous week we discussed a simple capacity model, and what about how can we go on and have a more detailed question and input model than just a station and trains? And is it possible to have input data, for example, not only the trains and stations, but also introducing, for example, the signaling system, speed, and etc. etc. I think that's also a nice question because the capacity model is always a tricky thing, because how much capacity you have to fulfill the theory with the timetabling, and it is really directly connected. What is available on capacity on the infrastructure? And these two have to have a match. When there is no match, you can forget it, because how to make more capacity, for example, in one day when you have more trains, but not the capacity on the rail, then you have nothing. So that's really a good balance, and that must be in balance. Otherwise you have no robust system you can drive trains in an operating way. Another question was about managing freight and passenger rail conflicts. And that was a question from the situation in the USA. And when I read carefully, and it was a little tricky because they said, okay, when we have private companies, we have in the States, for example, they are mostly done because of freight trains. And freight trains are in the highest priority. And why? That's easy, because they are owned by the company itself. So why should they go on with passenger trains? I think that's an easy question. Because yeah, when your business and your business model is based on the business case, how to make and transport freight, why should you bother about passenger trains? Because that's another stakeholder, and to be honest, it is not a stakeholder, because when it is the rolling stock and the infrastructure is owned by a company, why should you listen, or why should you take care of passenger trains? So that's the basics, and also the difference we have when you compare it to Europe. Because in Europe it is state-owned. That means everybody and all the questions and constraints from freight trains and passenger trains have a natural balance. So everybody has to have the same possibilities to do the train operations. I think that makes a more balanced system. But always, yeah, when there is trains for passengers or even more, you always have the other side, like freight trains. So what is the best? I would say there is no best. You have to collaborate with each other and respect to the capacity, and you have to share the capacity to all the stakeholders you have. And in Europe it is state-owned, so the state is more or less the referee, you could say about the demand and the capacity which is available. And when you look, for example, when it is not state-owned like in the USA, then the company who owned the infrastructure is demanding the system by themselves. Another question I have was about high-speed trains, dwell time at stations. It's a good question, because what is really the definition of a dwell time? And when I read carefully, I read by Alvaro that it says, okay, dwell time is also an important factor to estimate the capacity at stations, especially stop and end stations. But normally also cleaning and catering and inspection of the high-speed trains are tasks usually performed at the stations. And I think you're right. So when you look at that, then the capacity, what is really the capacity and the dwell time you need? Because to be honest, when you have an end station, also the buffering of the time of the operating of the train is also included in this dwell time. So what is dwell time, I would say? So that's also an issue you can doubt and argue about. But when you look in Holland, for example, mostly when we have an end stop, the train, then the train driver has to come out, or we have to change another driver, or we have to go from the back to the front, and that takes time. So mostly it is 5 minutes, and maybe you have 10 minutes in dwell time. But that's total. That's inclusive, the buffering, when you have a disruption or delay, that you have time to catch this 3 or 5 minutes extra. And the question is it fair to say, is this dwell time or not? So that's the question to you. Another question, a nice question I received from you, is about coordinating timetables. And that's a really good question when you look at the full system. Because the question is, what are the methods and what are the systems to do when you like to have a connection, for example, from one train to another, or even better, from one train to a bus or to a metro system. So in Holland we have a nice solution, because we said, okay, when the bus is coming from home, you pick it up, you go to the station, and when this bus driver is also the train driver, then you have no delay. Because when the bus is too late, then also the train is late. And that's no problem, because then you have a natural flow of transport. And I think that's exactly what we like as a passenger. But then you have to be lucky, because on these areas, then you have a small company who can do this connection. But normally you have to negotiate and have the timetable from the bus or the train or taxi or whatever to connect. So the best way, and what we learned here in Holland, is when you have a governance that one party is responsible for this bus drive and train drive, then it's easy to connect. Another question I have was about governance. The governance is very important for operation and scheduling, and I fully agree. But how important is the role of governance when it becomes the different operations and different rail and infra management? I think that's really a big issue, because when you have too much stakeholders, too much rolling stock owners, everybody has a demand, everybody has wishes, you have too much constraints, and then find the final equation solution. That's really the golden question. And how to do it, that's in all the different countries a different solution. It's not one big rule you could say how to do. The only thing I would say, please negotiate with each other and find a solution. That's the way. The last question I have was about involvement of the Netherlands and the government in railway business, and how to do, for example, do you have rates? Do you have some extra fee when you use the track and when you have problems? Or when do you have private lines, for example? Do you have to pay for that? So in Holland we don't have that. We only have high-speed line, partly financed by the private money, but also involved by the government. And I think in Holland the government has to push in a way, otherwise we don't have public transport, because the passenger has to pay the bill. And in Holland, I think the train rides would be too expensive. So there must be a role for the government. And yes, there is a possibility that private money is using for this. But another thing is, when you use private money, also the ticket price should be in that area. So what about that one? So I think that's really a big question. And when you look at this, are there some other fully private railways in Holland? And companies who are doing that, the answer is no, we don't have. And that's because we are in a European system. And I think the government is the key role player to solve these issues and not the private money, because private money means you have to the private money company has its own goals, and the goals will be the priority itself. So when you like to have a compromise on freight and passenger trains, I think you have to need the government itself. So thank you for this Ask the Professor questions. Please go on, keep on track, and keep on this course and make it safe. I think at the end you get the final question and the final case to solve. I think all the elements will come back. So good luck and see you on the next phase, maintenance and operations in together as one system in the next phase of this professional education. Good luck.